Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm a senior minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, which is a humanist congregation, and this is Coffee and Wisdom. The last couple of weeks, we have been looking at Christian theology and Unitarian Universalist theology, asking what is the there in Unitarian Universalist theology, comparing it with the more orthodox and traditional Christian ways of thinking. But so far, just as a quick recap, and you can find these online and on our YouTube channel, Den of Conversation, we've talked about Christology. That is, what is Jesus? Part of the Godhead, person, what's up with that? Also, we've dealt with hamartiology. That is the idea of sin, which is very specific within the Christian tradition. Theodicy, why do bad things happen to good people? And soteriology, what can save us? What offers salvation in life? We won't be looking at cosmology, anthropology, Mariology, or angelology because most Unitarian Universalists nowadays are naturalistic in their understanding of the universe, meaning that Mary was a person, angels probably aren't there, and the cosmology equals that which science has found, basically, as does the ideas of evolution and human consciousness. So there you are. Today, I do want to look at ecclesiology. That is how church is done. Ecclesia, of course, is the Latin word for church. One way that church can be done, that is governance, is the good old-fashioned way. This is the Roman Empire in action. Some people will argue that the Roman Empire still exists. It didn't ever fall because the exact structure was reproduced in the Roman Catholic Church with the Caesar replaced by the Pope, but you've got the Pope, cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and then priests. And it's a very set way of doing things. All of the lines of communication and not communication are clear, and the ideas flow from the top. The Vatican, Vatic meaning where God speaks. So God speaks at the Vatican, and the Pope listens, and everyone else listens to the Pope, basically the idea. And again, this totally reproduces the whole idea of the administrative structure of the Roman Empire, which actually worked pretty darn good. But as you can see, there's always someone up the tree, almost always, except for where the buck stops with the Pope or the Caesar. Another way of looking is the Episcopal model, and this is both the Church of England and also the Episcopal Church here in the U.S., and that is that you have an archbishop. Now, in England, of course, above the archbishop is royalty. In the U.S., not, but the archbishop, the bishops, and bishops, and rectors, and then congregations. Notice how this is also, however, a top-down model. You've got the preachers, the ministers in the congregation, and the people are at the bottom of the pyramid. Here's another one, the Presbyterian model. It's a little different. This is the one that the early American Puritans most feared, however, because it was catching on in England at the time, and especially in Scotland and Ireland. That is, there you have a General Assembly. That is the main body. This is the body of the whole, all the group. Unitarian Universalists nowadays have a General Assembly, but not in the early days. Presbytery, then a session of elders, again, a group of elders, not necessarily old nowadays, but in the old days, yes, then the congregation. And again, it's a top-down model in which the congregations are following the lead of this chain that goes up. Now, what we call this is polity, congregational polity. It comes from the Greek word citizenship or government, and ultimately from polis, which was the Greek word for cities. So polity of each congregation, every denomination has some kind of polity, even if it's this one, in which you've got God talking to the pastor who is talking to the people. Now, that should perhaps frighten us a little bit. There's a lot of room for gurus, for cult-like behavior, when the pastor talks directly to God and then relays that. That's a very dangerous model. And even in congregational polity, like the Unitarians and Universalists practice, they didn't trust that one because that just lets one individual do too much. The Congregationalist model that Unitarian and Universalists do follow comes from what's known as the Cambridge Platform of 1648. That is, of course, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it was something developed by the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. What happened is they came, of course, for religious freedom, which they set up as a theocracy in the colony. And then they started hearing about the Anglicans to the south, some Presbyterians out west. Oh my gosh, we've got to figure out and clearly state how we believe congregations should be governed. Now, this is contemporary language, I quickly point out. I don't recommend reading the Cambridge Platform unless you are, very, very into overheated Puritan language, shall we say. But let's listen to this, and because it still reflects the way Unitarian Universalist congregations work today. First, taking thought of each other's welfare, that is, each other being the congregations around one. Two, consulting on any topic or cause where another church has more familiarity or information about a topic. Nowadays, that works out as larger congregations sharing their resources in terms of various kinds of classes and electronic expertise, et cetera, with smaller congregations that really can't afford it. Number three, admonishing another church, even to the point of convening a synod of neighboring churches and ceasing communion with the offending church. That is, kicking somebody out. Now, what happened in the Congregationalist model in Massachusetts is when the argument between the Unitarians and the Trinitarians occurred, of course, they started kicking each other out. But that stayed at a congregational level. Four, allowing members of one church to fully participate and receive the Lord's Supper in another church. So we're going to recognize each other's communion, as it were. Five, sending letters of recommendation when a member goes to a new church due to a seasonal or permanent relocation. We don't do that too much anymore, but it is an old tradition because if the structure is a congregation rather than a region, for example, the people in the next town don't know this church member. So how do you get to know this person? And so they set up this idea of sending letters of support or not support for people who were moving from congregation to congregation. And lastly, financial support for poor churches, the bigger ones with more resources helping out the poor ones. 1648. Cambridge Platform, the relationships are horizontal, not top down. And this is very important to what happens with especially the Unitarians in Massachusetts. Since the relationships are horizontal, we are all equal, right? Except for the resources thing, they do point that out. Now, what the Puritans are thinking they're doing is they're saying this is how the early Christian church was set up. There's no structures talked about in the Christian scripture. So we want to follow the will of God in making our congregations. And there's nothing about bishops in there. We're just not going to deal with that. No structure. So within each congregation, the people of the congregation make decisions. They vote. It's democracy. And again, this sets up this idea of everyone having an equal voice. Now, you had to be a church member, and that was a fairly stringent way of getting in because, of course, they were still Calvinists. So they had to be sure that you were one of the elect before you could become a member. That's actually one of the things that overweighted the system eventually because there were very few people who came up to the mark of the Puritans. So they had a lot of people who were friends, but not members. And interestingly enough, enough, Unitarian Universalists today still have the idea of members and friends, unlike most church traditions. So the ministers are chosen and ordained by the congregation. Now, this is a little different nowadays because we have developed a structure, but theoretically, this is still true that any congregation can choose to ordain anyone they choose to ordain, and there's nothing the higher structures can do about that. In the day, the idea was that someone within the congregation would be chosen as the minister. Harvard College was set up by the Puritans to train their ministers. That's what it was all about. So they believed in a trained clergy even at that time, and that person would be trained and come back and be ordained by the congregation. In those days, you weren't a minister unless you were called in a church. When you retired, you were no longer a minister. So it was a very horizontal structure, and everyone knew where they were, what congregation they belonged to. But also one interesting thing occurred, and that is that very often they would choose a young minister, and that minister would grow old in the congregation. So you would have 30, 40, 50 years of one minister. And so people build up a lot of trust around this, but also the minister might keep reading because they're Harvard trained and start changing his mind about certain things. And that's what did begin to happen in the Puritan congregations with the Unitarians saying, wait a minute, I don't think this Trinity stuff is actually true. And then it just goes on cascading along. And that's how Unitarians left the Christian fold. The congregation chooses ministers, and therefore the congregation itself shapes the theology of the congregation. This is the absolute essence of what Unitarian Universalism was and how we got to where we are today. It continues. It is bottom up, not top down. We believe in democracy. Sometimes we get very tired of democracy, but theoretically we believe in democracy. And so the congregation itself chooses its ministers, and therefore the congregation itself perpetuates, carries on its theology. This is especially true at places like First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, where they started as a Darwin reading group, as I was mentioning the other day. And this guy comes along and say, hey, I'm a humanist. And the congregation goes, what's that? Sounds good. And we're going to be humanist in 1916. And that tradition has carried on to today with people passing it on down through the time period. So it's the people, the congregation that has kept the idea of humanism alive, not the ministers who have been chosen along the way. So that's what congregational polity will do. You don't have a pope up there. The people themselves are talking about these things and considering them, and the minister is not a leader so much as someone who's been chosen because of his or her talking points, probably. But it's about talking to each other. Interestingly enough, this is exactly the way the masjid system in Islam has also developed. There's no Pope of Islam. They also have a congregational polity. But we're one of the few groups in the world that has chosen to do this among the people rather than the top-down idea. So that's congregational polity and talking a little bit about theology the last couple of weeks. Next week, we're going to go off and talk about the human condition, because actually that is, of course, what creates theology anyway, the human condition. And we'll be considering that beginning on Monday. You can help us out. Go to YouTube, go to Facebook, like us on Twitter, Instagram. The more people who like us and share things, the more our message does get out there. You can also help financially on PayPal or firstunitarian.org/donate. And we will see you at Assembly, 10:30 a.m. Central Time on Sunday. Have a great weekend.